You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
And this is London, but broadcasting to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet. It's been another incredible week. I mean that in the literal sense. Boris Johnson was carted into intensive care. The Prime Minister of Britain was on an oxygen tube. And just a couple of days after being released from the ICU, he's at Chequers and fit enough to give a remarkable address to the country, to the world, on his prime ministerial broadcast this week. I, for one, want to say how glad I was to see him looking so healthy in the circumstances, a remarkable recovery. I really feared for the worst when he went into the ICU. But he's shown that he's made of stern stuff. He's also shown that he's capable of epiphany. His epiphany seems to have included a remarkable transformation in his attitude to the National Health Service, to doctors, and especially perhaps to nurses. That's especially remarkable because I saw him, along with other Conservative MPs, cheering to the rafters in the House of Commons when they defeated a motion to increase the pay of National Health Service workers, including the very nurses that saved Boris Johnson's life. Now, it is possible in life for people to make miraculous recoveries. Our own director is living proof of that. He's back at work, hale and hearty this very day. His was a quick recovery too. So it is possible, and I cast no aspersions. It's also possible, especially I should say this, on Easter Sunday, it is possible for sinners to repent. Certainly every word that Boris Johnson said in his broadcast today was true, but every word of it will be cut out and kept. In fact, it will be nailed to a lot of walls, including my own, and every word of it will be thrown back in his face if he does not now do the logical thing of doing right by our National Health Service. That means, Prime Minister, that you have to pay them fairly what you now know that they are worth. That means, Prime Minister, that you need to fund the service in which they work adequately. That means, Prime Minister, that you have to equip and protect them safely as they continue to battle with this unseen enemy of which you spoke today. It is necessary, Prime Minister, for you to take that precious heart of the nation, as you described it, back wholly into public ownership, into the public sector. It is time for you to kick the money changers out of the temple, to overturn their tables, to send Richard Branson and the other buccaneers packing, and make sure that our NHS is in wholly public hands. And one last thing, as I pioneered here last week, and which is now the official policy of Her Majesty's opposition, it would seem you need to cancel the student debt of every employee in the National Health Service. If you did those things, Prime Minister, the country would clap you on Thursday, along with the National Health Service workers. If you do these things, then people will love you, actually. But if you don't do them, and if you fall far short of doing them, then many people are going to consider you one of the largest walking hypocrites ever to stroll the highways and byways of this green and pleasant land. Mind you, Boris Johnson would never have been the Prime Minister, and Theresa May would have been the briefest Prime Minister in history if it were not for the active sabotage by the Parliamentary Labour Party and by the upper and middle and lower echelons of the Labour Party's headquarters staff in the run-up to the general election of 2017. Jeremy Corbyn failed to become our Prime Minister on that occasion, despite achieving 40% of the vote, despite lifting the Labour vote by a greater number of votes than any Labour leader ever since Clement Attlee in the Labour landslide of 1945. Jeremy Corbyn fell just under 2,500 votes short of achieving a parliamentary majority. That's all. 2,370 or so. If these had fallen in the right constituencies, Boris Johnson would never have been the Prime Minister. Jeremy Corbyn would have now been into his third year as Prime Minister of Great Britain. How do I know all this? Well, I've always known it, and so have many of you, but I've never been able to prove it before. But now I can. Because the leaked report, copious, compendious, encyclopedic report from the Labour Party itself, designed to be handed to the Equal Rights and Human Rights Commission, ECHRC, this report, which has now been suppressed by the new Labour leadership, Sir Keir Starmer et al., is the most obscene publication that I have ever read. I have never quite read. In fact, I felt a rising sense of revulsion as I saw the WhatsApp group messages, as I saw the texts, as I saw the emails between the General Secretary of the Labour Party and directors of various departments in the Labour Party, actively sabotaging the Labour general election campaign, actively undermining their own party's chances of winning, and their recoiling in horror when Labour began to catch up. They're recoiling in terror at the possibility that Corbyn might be in number 10 Downing Street come Friday. I have read, seen, experienced a lot of things in my life, but I've never read anything quite like the suppressed report that Keir Starmer must publish. It must be published in full, and anyone who has a copy of it has a duty to history, to Labour, to the working class, and to the people of this country to publish this report, which establishes inter alia that the anti-Semitism scandal in Labour was a wholly internally manufactured lie, one of the biggest lies in history, and that those members of the Labour Party's staff actively conspired one with the other, both to inflate the scandal and to frustrate any attempt to resolve whatever problems had been thrown up on this track of anti-Semitism. It is confirmed beyond any contradiction that Jeremy Corbyn, far from being anti-Semitic, was struggling might and main in a way that none of his predecessors had done, and that the new General Secretary was struggling in a way that none of her predecessors had done, to ensure that there was no stain of the foul poison of anti-Semitism to be found anywhere in the Labour Party. It is also established, beyond contradiction, that the whole thing was an attempt at a political assassination, an attempt which in the end was successful. Now, I hold no candle, fly no flag for Jeremy Corbyn. I am in a better position than most to know of his failings, shortcomings, and yes, betrayals. I'm a living example of Jeremy Corbyn's betrayals. But as I said, and I was the only person in the British media to say crystal clear, loudly, from the start, on television, on radio, on video, on the streets, in print, I told you, all of you, that this was a manufactured crisis. This was the weaponizing of one of the biggest lies in all history. This was a slander against history, a slander against posterity, a slander against all that is good and holy. I told you that. I almost lost my job for telling you that. I told you it every week, and I was the only one that was telling you it. So I'm not here to praise Jeremy Corbyn. Heaven knows I'm not. But I am here to damn forever those that were ready to cheapen, to devalue, to coarsen the sacred duty of all people to fight racism and to fight anti-Semitism, arguably the most poisonous strain of racism, certainly in centuries, one which cost 6 million Jews their lives and scarred the lives of those who miraculously escaped the gas chambers and the concentration camps. For anyone to use the shrouds of those dead souls, for anyone to use the ancient and historic suffering of the Jewish people just to bring down Jeremy Corbyn? Really? Is that as low as you will go? And speaking of Sir Keir Starmer and Lisa Nandy, who've been out batting for the government today, they're supposed to be Her Majesty's opposition. But both Starmer and Nandy have been defending the government on television today. Both of them said that this crisis could not have been foreseen. But that is untrue. It was foreseen. It was entirely predictable. It was indeed predicted. But you didn't have to look in the crystal ball. You could look at the book in China that was open since the 31st of December last year. You could have done what China did, and you could have had weeks and weeks of time in order to do it. You could have saved thousands of lives in Britain. But the government did not. It wasted those weeks. It flirted with the eugenicist poison of herd immunity, where all of us will take it on the chin and the devil will take the hindmost. And by the hindmost, we mean your mother and father, grandmother and grandfather, elderly aunt and elderly uncle. And then it lurched to a lockdown that isn't a lockdown at all. Then it promised testing, which it has never delivered. Then it promised that the hardware, the ventilators, all the things that the NHS needed would be ordered, albeit from a vacuum cleaner manufacturer who'd never made a ventilator in his puff, but they never arrived. They said, Hancock said in print, that we were well stocked with personal protection equipment, that we had no need for more masks, more aprons, more gowns. But we did. And then they promised that they'd ordered them. But they've only just arrived on Friday. They claim, I'll wait myself to see if that claim is any more true than the previous claims. But in any case, what they claim that they have secured is not sufficient even for the NHS. And it's completely missing for transport workers who are now dying like flies as a result of a lockdown that isn't a lockdown, that leaves buses and tube trains packed like sardines. The passengers, no doubt, infecting each other, and without doubt, infecting and killing our transport workers. I was in a shop yesterday. None of the staff had masks. Nobody seems to have masks, unless, like me, you've trekked 100 pharmacies and had the means to pay through the nose in order to buy them. No testing, no PPE, not enough ventilators, not enough intensive care beds. Isn't that what the leaders of Britain's opposition should be saying? Shouldn't the leaders of Her Majesty's opposition be opposing in order to keep ministers and government on its toes? You would have thought so. And lastly, Bernie Sanders has thrown in the towel again. Like the grand old Duke of York, though with far more than 10,000 men, he marched them up to the top of the hill and he marched them down again. Last time, it might have been forgivable. Hillary Clinton was a formidable political operator. Donald Trump, an unknown quantity, and in any case, not expected to win. But to march them down the hill again this time, Bernie, and expect your supporters to vote for creepy, sleepy Joe Biden, a man accused of rape, is asking too much. They will not do it. You just guaranteed that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States, just as Hillary Clinton guaranteed it on the ballot paper last time. Now, if America had a left-wing royal family, my first guest would definitely be a member of it. Robbie Martin is the brother of the wonderful Abby Martin, and Robbie is pretty wonderful himself. He's co-host of Media Roots Radio. He's a filmmaker, and I'm glad to say he joins us now on the mother of all talk shows. Robbie, a great pleasure to see you in the flesh. I hope one day to shake your hand or at least bump your elbow. Let's review the scene, shall we, in the United States. Let's start with the virus. It seems to be devastating the United States, health and wealth. It seems to be devastating the economy, and it seems to be killing a gigantic number of people. Survey that scene for us, if you will.
Yeah, it's quite a nightmare scenario, George. And thank you for having me on your program. It's an honor. It can't possibly be put into words how terrible this situation is, but I'll try. Initially, the biggest problem here, George, was that the U.S. government was doing all they could, including the CDC, to cover up and to sort of brush under the rug that COVID-19 had already, broken out in Seattle. And it basically cost valuable amounts of time how much people were dragging their feet, government officials, even just governors. This blame cannot all go to Trump, even though he deserves quite a bit of it. You see quite a disparity between, for example, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, on the same day that Gavin Newsom said that we should shelter in place in California, that this was very dangerous. We need to mitigate the spread of this. Bill de Blasio was encouraging people to go to the movies. So it's not just Trump's fault, because you also have all these state governors and these, different municipalities all disagreeing with each other. And so it almost, in some ways, was complete chaos in terms of the instructions about what we're supposed to do as a society to prepare for this. So I guess, you can make the argument that some of these European countries, they have a more, top-down approach, less fragmentation, so they're able to implement these policies more quickly. So that was a big part of the problem here. But then another problem, George, was the lack of available testing. Per million people, the U.S. for weeks, when this outbreak first started, had the lowest amount per million people in terms of testing available. And now that we have so much testing going on, what we discovered is, oops, we actually have by far the most cases in the world. And now it seems like we're actually, I haven't checked the recent stats, but it seems like we're getting close to having the most deaths in the world too. Maybe we've already surpassed it, actually.
No, I think you're just behind Italy. You'll pass it this week for sure.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, that's great news. So yeah, things they almost couldn't be worse than they are right now. And, in terms of what's going to happen next, I guess the only thing we could hope for is that some of this social distancing that's been put in place, and in some states was put in place way too late, will mitigate the spread of this. That's my best hope. In California, it seems as if it actually has had a pretty big impact in terms of the, what they say, flattening the curve. I don't want to be too optimistic, but it seems like states like California have, by acting more quickly, have actually, kind of gotten ahead of the curve of this. So I think that's a good sign.
Now, what about the economy, Robbie? More people are unemployed in the United States now. I think the figure is now over 10 million people. It is predicted that within a couple of weeks, the rate of unemployment, the percentage of people unemployed in the United States, will be greater than it was in the Great Depression, which was a figure of 25%. We all know the pictures of the Great Depression, of tent cities, of soup kitchens, of the Dust Bowl, and all of that. How much are people aware and fearful of what the economic impact of this is going to be, and how is American society going to cope with that?
Well, it's such a depressing thought, George, and you're right about the numbers. I think somewhere that they're projecting somewhere within the range of 30% unemployment. I think part of the problem is there's such an economic disparity in the United States that people who can hunker down right now during this and can shelter in place comfortably, and, for example, can order their groceries delivery and don't have to, tough it out and go out in the wilderness with the mask on and try to go grocery shopping, those people aren't going to feel these things yet, or they haven't felt them yet, but they will, eventually, once they realize that 30% of the population is unemployed. I think right now the people that are feeling it the hardest are the people who've actually already lost their jobs. And there's, like you said, 10 million people have already lost their jobs. That's a huge deal. And I think it's going to start making the people of higher privilege, higher income levels more aware over time. And it's going to be a really rude awakening for them once they realize that a lot of these, service industry people they rely on, a lot of these businesses they rely on for their convenience are going to be closed after this. And that's, just the tip of the iceberg. Having that much mass unemployment, will cause all these other terrible societal ripple effects, including, George, one that I'm personally really concerned about is some kind of desperate position the United States gets in where it feels the need to go to war again, and some kind of very show-offy, sort of patriotic, we need to rally together as a society and come out of this great recession, with some kind of nationalistic, patriotic outburst. So that's where my mind is going in terms of the recession.
That's obviously one of the directions in which it could go. And another is an outbreak of mass criminality. There are always poor and desperate people in the US and in any society. But when there's millions of poor and desperate people, those that have will have to worry that those that have not will be coming to get them, will be coming to take from them.
Well, yeah, there's an element of, I mean, that's one of the things that that differs the United States from a lot of these other countries around the world, is that we have the highest rate of people incarcerated in prisons of our own population here. So that's definitely a factor. And it's also not helped by the fact that we don't have any kind of form of universal basic income or any sort of surplus package, going directly to people who are suffering right now. And it's, they're giving out stimulus checks, but it's a pittance really, and hasn't come yet. There's people in desperate need right now. So yeah, as long as we have those factors in place, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, a destabilization of American society, I think, is definitely in the cards. And, even on some level, this Abby and I were discussing this concept of sort of global unrest. The elites and the powers that be have been, hedging on this idea of a form of global unrest, or not just regional collapse like in the United States, but some form of mass global collapse. And this could be another situation that they could take advantage of, in that same way, sort of like a disaster capitalism board, but for the globe. And then in addition to that, draconian laws, put in place that'll just restrict people's rights even more and take away people's privacy, as we're seeing with these app, suggestions in the United States to how to track people with the virus to see if they're sick or not.
Mind you, all is not lost. We've got Joe Biden. The Democrats have now effectively picked Joe Biden. I'd like your views, please, on whether it is really credible that come November it'll be his name on the ballot paper. The more I see of him, the more I hear of him, the more I suspect that somehow, I don't know how, somehow someone else will be parachuted into his place. Your views on that, please, Robbie.
That's an interesting theory, George. I mean, I could see why you would think that. I mean, he does seem to be exhibiting very real signs of cognitive decline in ways that I have not seen any other person running for the presidency exhibit. So that alone, I think that's possible. I don't know who the hell it would be. People are saying it's going to be Cuomo. I don't think that's going to happen. But, I think one factor of this is, will the election be delayed, the general election? And from what I understand about that is the president himself cannot actually authorize that. It would have to be the Congress, pushing some kind of legislation through. So from what we understand, it would be really difficult to actually move the general election date. But in terms of Joe Biden, I mean, there's no way he's going to win against Donald Trump. And there has to be establishment Democrats who are very high up, in the party, in the DNC, who absolutely know that to be the case. So the question then becomes, are they actually kind of agreeing to take the hit this time and allowing Donald Trump to essentially get another 4 years just so they don't have to allow someone like Bernie to take the nomination? It seems to me that seems like the play, George. But what you're saying is also possible. I'm trying to think of who it could be. And, I don't want to think it would be Hillary. That sounds like a Twilight Zone kind of scenario. But, people have been pushing out rumors that she could still run again. I don't know. I have no idea who it would be, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did that. But I think whoever they would replace Biden with at this point will lose against Trump, because the only chance I think for Trump getting out of this election was this situation. How is he going to handle the COVID-19 pandemic? That could have been a referendum on him. And I think that opportunity's already passed. And I don't think that ultimately that's what it's going to be. I think that he's already effectively spun it so that he looks great again during this process. I'm not very hopeful, George. I think we're looking for another 4 years of Trump, towards another 4 years of Trump.
I think you're probably right on that. Robbie Martin, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Why is the UK government not counting out of hospital virus deaths? Is it A, too politically damaging, B, protecting the public, or C, don't have the figures? You can vote now on my Twitter feed. Why is the UK government not counting out of hospital virus deaths? A, too politically damaging, B, protecting the public, C, don't have the figures. Paul says, good to have you back. My weekly chance to listen to something other than the usual mainstream media take on this whole COVID-19 situation. Now parents of sick children are being asked to sign do not resuscitates, as well as elderly patients. And Tony says, we need to know how many have died from coronavirus and how many have died with coronavirus. Two different things. Why are they different, Tony? I'm really puzzled at how you conspiracy theorist, libertarian, ultra-left, anarchistic maniacs think. If I have cancer and walk in front of a train, what killed me? The train or the cancer? There are plenty of people, I know some of them, living with underlying health conditions. There are plenty of people who might have died in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, maybe even 36 months, but who catch the coronavirus and die. So what killed them? The underlying condition from which they would not have died if they had not caught the coronavirus or the coronavirus. Why are you obfuscating? Why this fake dichotomy that people like you and others that I've worked with, and I'm embarrassed now to have had even on my own show, I've had to block them. I want nothing more to do with them. I'm embarrassed at some of the things I read, particularly on the comments on YouTube. To take a half an hour reading the comments on my YouTube broadcasts is to wander into Bellevue. It's to wander into Broadmoor, down the aisles and around the beds of Ward 5. This is madness. All around us you can see nurses weeping as they come off their shift, doctors dying on the front line, your neighbors dying, your relatives dying, all around you, all around the world. Who is it that's lying, Tony? Boris Johnson? Maybe. Tony Hancock? Maybe. Are the Russians also lying? Are the Chinese also lying? Is Dr. Ranjeet Brar, a communist, also lying? Is the World Health Organization lying? Get a grip of yourself, man. James says, call me cynical, but Mr. Johnson is the first patient in history to emerge from the ICU faster than he went in. Love the show. James. And Connor in Belfast, an old friend. I'd like to hear what you think of Robin Swan, our health minister's repeated call for the British Army to come to the north of Ireland and help with the current crisis. Personally, as a construction worker, there are enough self-employed of us out of work who could do this work. Very sensitive request for Mr. Swan to call. Well, that would seem to me an unnecessarily provocative act, and I don't think it will happen. It is Easter Sunday, of course, and it would be remiss not to commemorate the heroes of the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916. As Lenin put it, the blow struck by the Irish rebellion against the British Empire was many times more powerful than any similar act of rebellion in Africa or in Asia. It was not the first blow struck against the British Empire, but it was a most decisive one. It was a military failure, but it was the most gigantic political success. The uprising at the General Post Office in 1916 issued a proclamation for a united and independent sovereign Irish Republic. I was listening to some readings of it today. It still has the capacity, 104 years later, to stir the blood, at least my blood. One of the most sordid of the aspects of this current situation is that far from, as the United Nations asked, as the Pope has asked, as any sane person has asked, for all wars and conflicts at least to be suspended for the duration, for all acts of war to be eschewed in favour of international cooperation as we battle to defeat an unseen, unseeable global behemoth of the coronavirus 19. But the United States has instead taken the opportunity to double down on its attempts to seek to destabilize and defeat, to change the regimes in various countries, including countries that are in the vanguard of humanity in responding to the crisis. Cuba, for example, is now on even sharper sanctions than it was before the coronavirus began, not least because anybody trying to buy Cuba's world-leading medical technology in the current climate, the United States has made clear that anyone who buys from Cuba will be sanctioned by the United States. Even ventilators are being blockaded in the time of the coronavirus. It's hard to believe, I know, but it's happening. It's happening in Iran, which for a time at least was one of the world's most affected places from the virus. It's happening in Venezuela, where so far it's not such a crisis as it is in the United States, which is besieging it. But that hasn't stopped the US besieging it. They've stepped up their attempts to overthrow the government in Venezuela. The war criminal Tony Blair has just had a meeting with the imposter Juan Guaido. No social distancing there because, hey, there's an oil heist at stake. The two of them, thick as thieves, were shoulder to shoulder, as Tony always is with the worst people in the world. The United States has sent soldiers to Colombia, next door to Venezuela. It sent its warships to the coast of Venezuela. It may be planning a war against Venezuela. As Robbie Martin said earlier, that might be a useful diversion from the travails at home. One man who charts all of these things with meticulous detail, style, and panache is a former guest of ours and one of my heroes. He's Dan Kovalik, and he's on the line now. Dan, you've got a new book called No More War, which is a good title, sums up what I've just been saying. You're a human rights and labor rights lawyer. You're a professor, an author, and a filmmaker. Through your viewfinder, how does all that look?
Yes, well, it is looking quite terrible. And first, I just want to thank you again for having me on, George. It's
Welcome.
Always a delight.
Welcome.
You know, what you were summarizing it should be shocking to people that during this crisis, which is a worldwide crisis, which is affecting nearly every country on earth, and by the end will affect every country on earth, the U.S. in particular has decided to use the crisis as an opportunity to destabilize other countries, to overthrow other governments. And, you know, some of the aircraft carriers, some of the warships, for example, that the U.S. has now sent to the Caribbean, to the coast of Venezuela, we know some of these ships are now literally virus incubators, right? The fact that the U.S. is sending troops to other countries means risking spreading this virus further, even in allied countries. You mentioned Colombia, which is the closest ally of the U.S. in South America. When we send troops to those countries, we are risking spreading the virus. And by the way, most of the spread of the virus in Venezuela is now coming from the border with Colombia as Venezuelans return to Venezuela during this crisis. And so it is the height of imperial hubris. It is the height of cruelty to be trying to use a pandemic to gain geopolitical advantage at this time. But that's exactly what's happening right now.
What about Nicaragua? They seem to, as we discussed on my other show, Sputnik, they seem to have rediscovered their ire against Nicaragua and the Sandinista government there, democratically elected government. What's going on there now?
Well, things right now are quite stable. The virus has not gained a lot of ground in Nicaragua. They have an excellent healthcare system under the Sandinista government, which is in charge right now. But the U.S., again, has taken the opportunity to increase sanctions against that country during this pandemic. And sadly, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch have actually applauded the U.S. government for doing that. And so we are jeopardizing the lives of Nicaraguans by these sanctions. Will make it harder for Nicaragua to fight this virus. Meanwhile, Nicaragua, not surprisingly, has welcomed Cuban doctors to their country to help fight the pandemic. And the U.S. is upset about that as well. So Nicaragua can expect more hostilities during this time, even though in Central America, they're doing the best job right now at containing the virus.
Of course, Italy, therefore, will be in the firing line because Italy's got Cuban doctors. There are Cuban doctors all over Europe. 26 countries have got Cuban doctors. The British Foreign Secretary just wrote a letter to the president of Cuba hailing their act of outstanding solidarity in accepting into their harbour the British cruise ship that was full of infected people. Nobody else would take it, but Cuba took it. In a way, the malice towards Cuba is the most grotesque of all. 26 countries, Cuba sending doctors to, America sending more and more sanctions on Cuba.
No, it's absolutely stunning what is happening. First of all, you mentioned Italy. Italy made it clear that the EU had abandoned them. They did nothing for them during this crisis. So Italy turned to the countries that would help them, and that was Cuba, it was China, who willingly helped. Cuba is under now over 50, has been under sanctions by the U.S. for over 50 years. Has been the victim of a crippling blockade by the U.S. for over 50 years, and yet they find the wherewithal to help these other countries. It is awe-inspiring what Cuba is doing. But again, the U.S. has decided it will make it harder for Cuba to do that work and to, frankly, to help their own people. There have been specific instances in which the U.S. has blocked medical supplies to Cuba during this pandemic. It is the height of cruelty, but Cuba does stand out as a shining example of what type of international solidarity we need at this very time. In fact, Pope Francis today called in St. Peter's Square for international solidarity and for the end of international sanctions during this time. And he was quite right to do it.
He was indeed. God save him and preserve him. Now, tell us about your book, No More War. Is it naive, this call? How do we get to a situation of no more war?
Well, I would hope that during this time of crisis, we would learn about not only the futility of war, but frankly, the devastating nature of war, not only to those that we attack, but to ourselves. You know, the fact that the U.S. has spent trillions of dollars on these destructive and seemingly pointless wars in the Middle East has left the U.S. crippled in its ability to fight this virus. And that's why we see the U.S., which had been ranked so high before this crisis as being this model for health care, we see it unable to deal with the crisis. We see the numbers higher in the U.S. than any country in the world, and those numbers will continue to go up. The numbers of those who are dying due to this virus. And the fact that the U.S. spends trillions of dollars, the fact that the U.S. has money for bombs and for weapons, but doesn't have money for ventilators or even face masks. You have the President of the United States go on TV and tell the American people they should use T-shirts to make masks with because we don't have any. And why? Because all that money has gone out the door to fight wars. And I hope truly that people will be educated by this moment.
Now, the great Oliver Stone, a man we both admire very much indeed, he's associated with this book. Tell us.
Yes, well, he has a great quote on the front of the book talking about how this book cuts through the Orwellian lies that make so-called humanitarian intervention possible. Stone has been someone who has been writing and making films about the dangers of war and aggression for many years. It should be pointed out that Stone himself, while greatly vilified by the mainstream media, he actually quit Yale to fight in Vietnam, and it was there where he was educated about what U.S. war meant. And in Vietnam, it meant killing women and children on a mass scale. It meant destroying their forests and their farms. And Stone has taken an interest in this book because he has seen firsthand what war means.
Well, if it's good enough for Oliver Stone, it's good enough for me. Where can people buy it, Professor?
Yes, well, they can get it on Amazon. They can get it at their local bookstores when those bookstores, of course, open. But many bookstores, at least, they can order from at this time. And if people follow me on Facebook or Twitter, hey, and they need a book, I'll find a way to get them a book. So,
fabulous.
If for me, it's about spreading the message. It's about fighting the war machine, which we need to continue doing.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Dan Kovalik from the United States. His new book, No More War, a must-read. Spring Morning Glory says Britain and China scientists are working together to come up with more reliable and quick result testing kits for the public. Wish them success. Unbearable Pain says China is a red herring. It's nonsense to blame a country for a virus. They live in a chemical fog of poison. And my old friend Tad Davidson says, I agree totally on reducing, if not totally eliminating, the power of the globalists and the corporations. It's badly needed. But how short of civil insurrection? That nearly happened in 1933 in the United States of America. I do worry about what will happen in America, not least because 100 million of them have got guns, and many of them several guns. Ali Jones says, why has Hancock not called out the billionaires, just like he did with the footballers? Dare not call out their party donors. It was a bit rich, if you'll forgive the pun, picking on working-class footballers for their extremely high level of wages at the top end of the game, not shared by those in the middle and at the lower ends of the game, whilst not asking the billionaires, so far, to pay a penny extra. L.A. Taylor says, Bill Gates wants everybody who is and isn't vaccinated. What's wrong with being vaccinated, L.A. Taylor? All my children are vaccinated. I am vaccinated. What do you think Bill Gates, who, as I understand it, himself suffers from a terminal illness, what is it he's after? Is it more money? Actually, he gave most of his money away. Is it a longer life? How does it give him a longer life if a vaccine against the coronavirus is provided? Basil Faulty says David Icke needs to be arrested. Atul Nayak says BBC is an outdated propaganda machine. Hear, hear to that. Caroline Flanagan says the UK is dysfunctional now. I'm looking for Dr. Gerard Lyons, my next guest, but he is now available. Now, Dr. Gerard Lyons, one of the smartest men I've ever interviewed on my Sputnik show, and also, I think, here on the MOATS. He's an economist. He's chief economic strategist at Netwealth Investments. Economic impact of coronavirus very much uppermost in his mind, as it will be in time in the minds of all of us. Dr. Lyons, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Good evening.
Just survey the economic scene for us, will you? What is the principal damage that will be done to the economy by this virus, this pandemic?
Well, we have a global recession, and pretty much the same impact is being felt in most economies, namely a slump in income and in spending. That's hit firms as well as individuals and has led to a slump in global trade. Now, China and the rest of East Asia was hit in January and February. China has shown tentative signs of picking up in March, but it's still early to say it's fully past the worst. But what we've seen is that the US, the UK and Western Europe have literally fallen off the edge of a cliff in March. That weakness is likely to continue through the second quarter. There is now a big policy response. So the hope is, and indeed my expectation is, that while Q3 will also be weak, we're likely to see some sort of recovery before the end of this year. So a global recession hitting hard now and likely to remain hard and tough for some months to come yet.
Let's start with the United States, please. The 17 million people have applied for welfare benefits in the United States this week. More than 10 million are unemployed. Many projections are that the Great Depression, 25% unemployment, that figure will be surmounted. And on the principle that, as we saw in the 1930s, when America catches cold, the rest of the world catches pneumonia. What's the impact of the American economic downturn going to be?
Well, I think you're right to say that when the US, the world's biggest economy, is hit so hard, it has a global impact. What's happening at the moment is that even though China is past the worst, it seems, we've pretty much had a synchronized collapse in the advanced economies. Now, the good news, if one can call it that, is that the US, in policy terms, have responded pretty aggressively and very quickly. So even though that will not stop US unemployment rising significantly, and while that will not stop a US recession, at least the good news is that the US policy response has been pretty significant. I would tend to call the US response the three U's rather. Unconventional, it's been unlimited, particularly from the Federal Reserve, the central bank, and it's been pretty urgent. They've responded pretty well. But coming back to your question, George, there's no doubt that the US downturn, while obviously hitting the US hard, will reinforce the global downturn, particularly in the next 3 to 4 months.
Now, let's look at their response, please, Gerard, because many people would say helicoptering out $1,200 to every American isn't going to butter that many parsnips, and that the incredible bonanza that has been handed out to the corporations will disappear into the maw. In what way do you think that response will protect the US economy from the collapse in demand?
Okay, well, in terms of protect, the word I would use would be that it's trying to mitigate, that is, limit or offset the scale of the impact. The most impressive thing in particular, I think, in the US has been the response of the US Federal Reserve. Now, it has to be said, in the wake of the global financial crisis a decade ago, global central banks, led by the Americans, basically became the shock absorber for the global economy. They don't have much room for maneuver left as we go into this hit. Therefore, more of the heavy lifting this time should be done on fiscal policy or by fiscal policy. But what we've seen in the US is that the Federal Reserve has said that they will provide unlimited help. Their balance sheet has already risen sharply. So that will underpin the markets. It will provide financing in terms of the corporate sector. But in terms of your question, the reality of these situations is that the poorest tend to be hit hardest, and those people in jobs that can be cut quickest tend to see their jobs basically go. What we're trying to see, though, from the US and to some extent from other policymakers in the West is an attempt to try and ensure that this is a temporary hit. But the scale of it is so considerable, namely to the world economy, it's hard to imagine this will be a completely temporary hit. Unfortunately, there may be some permanent impact. But I think the US response has been pretty good in terms of throwing money, unlimited help from the central bank. But you're right, in terms of the distribution aspect of it, I think many people are looking at that as a secondary issue. But I think Congress is now trying to force through another fiscal package to ensure that some of those issues are addressed.
Now, you're a man, you believe in this economic system. I don't. So with that in mind, I pose you this question.
Yeah.
Isn't all this being done with funny money? I mean, they're just turning the presses, metaphorically, aren't they? This is not real money, not backed by anything. It's just running more money off the printing press. What are the consequences likely to be of that?
Yeah, well, this is an active debate. It's been an active debate even before this crisis, with MMT, modern monetary theory, being talked about within the US in particular. Like many theories, well, economics is a sort of social science. It's not a hard science like physics. And therefore, one has to look at some of these policy stances in terms of the context of the day. I think we're in such a situation now where inflationary pressures are minimal, hence the focus on oil in the last 24 hours with OPEC and non-OPEC countries trying to limit supply, and that being seen as a positive thing by many economists and by the markets in order to stop deflationary pressures taking hold. So I think there is the ability, there is the scope for central banks to actually provide direct financing to the government. So-called funny money, as you call it, but I wouldn't call it that. I would call it necessary action. But at the same time, in a similar respect, but not the same argument, many people have been critical about the use of fiscal policy in the past. I, however, would argue that now is also the time to be proactive in terms of fiscal policy, just because of the slump to the demand and income. But like many of these policy responses, they need to be coordinated, they need to be credible, but also the question is the scale as well. And that very much leads on to your question. I think if we were still asking it in 3, 6, 9, 12 months' time, then people might have a more valid reason to be concerned. But when you look at the situation, there is the ability for central banks to be more accommodative in this sort of environment, and there certainly is the scope and the ability for governments to relax fiscal policy more. I think also it should be said that governments should find it relatively easy, despite the scale, to fund much of their spending, given that international long-term investors are looking for safe havens, hence bond yields are incredibly low.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time always, Doctor, what about Britain? What is the likely impact, both of the devastation that has been caused and the government's response to it, in your view?
Well, Britain is a microcosm in some respects of what's happening elsewhere. We have a health crisis and an economic crisis. We really need to overcome the health crisis in order to start to make inroads into the economic crisis. So addressing the health issue is one thing, addressing the economic problem is another, but both almost need to run in tandem. Here in the UK, I think the government has been willing, so too is the central bank. I think the government's response needs to be less complex, shall we say. The American response is simpler in terms of getting money out there quicker. Here in the UK, we've not provided the help as quickly to the corporate sector, particularly small firms. So I think the government, even though it's trying to do the right thing, and I'm constructive about what they're doing, they need to do more. The central bank here, I think, could take a lesson from the US and provide more unlimited help. Also, I'd like to see the central bank here, and indeed other central banks, peg long-term rates. So there are technical answers to your questions. But what it does do in the UK is I think it reinforces some of the policies that we've been talked about before the crisis. There are many parts of the UK economy that are brilliant, first-rate, world-class, but we have a very imbalanced economy. Those imbalances, I think, will become clearer as we come out of this crisis. So in some respects, it reinforces the need for the UK to focus on what I call all the I's: investment, innovation, infrastructure spending, incentives, and clearly the most important I, inequality. So I think that even though we have a big problem in the UK, and even though I think the policy response has been good, I think we need to do more on the policy side. We need to make sure that while it's a temporary hit, it doesn't become a permanent hit to the economy. And I think we have a big challenge there. But when we come out of it, I think many of the imbalances that we talked about before the crisis will still be staring us in the face. And in some respects, the policy outlined beforehand needs to become even more apparent after.
Always a pleasure. Dr. Gerard Lyons, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Our own MOATS medic, one of the NHS's heroes, is Dr. Ranjeet Brar. He's an NHS consultant, physician and surgeon. He is a vascular surgeon in the north of England. He's with me, I hope, on Skype. Dr. Ranjeet, welcome back to the show. Let me just put to you what not a few of our listeners, viewers, have said, that actually this is all really a bit of a hoax and that the hospitals are half empty. Your comments, please.
Surprised, George, that we're, first of all, nice to be with you. Thanks for having me back again. I'm surprised that we're back on that subject, George. The evidence keeps on mounting from every quarter. It seems very hard to justify the concept that this is not a very real phenomenon. Hospitals have cut down their elective and normal workload. There will undoubtedly be a knock-on effect from that. That will affect the real health and outcome of a large number of patients. But we know there are studies that have come out from China and elsewhere that shows that actually patients who come to hospital at this time are very likely to be infected with coronavirus, that patients who undergo surgery and then subsequently showed to have been infected with coronavirus have a much higher, perhaps as much as 20% mortality rate. So this is not a time for undergoing unnecessary procedures. What it does show is that, it shows up things about our society that we had been noticing, but in a very acute form. And one of them is just the undercapacity within the NHS. China, whilst dealing with this, didn't have to forego the care of other patients. And it's, again, a great shame, a crying shame, really, that we're unable to cope with both this, yes, high and unusual demand, but unable to cope with so many other health needs simultaneously. And I think this is something that we are going to have to return to and reassess in the way we fund and manage our National Health Service.
Well, if you heard the Prime Minister's broadcast earlier today, you'll know that you've got probably your biggest fan in the leader of the Conservative Party. Now, you and I both know that the Conservatives had to be dragged screaming and kicking into accepting the existence of a National Health Service. We both know that it cuts against their general socio-economic approach to things. They generally believe private is better than public. But unless he's a gigantic liar, and unless he has no conception that we all tape recorded his speech and will play it back constantly, he must know that what he did today was give a gigantic vote of confidence in the NHS, which will have to be backed up with hard cash and changes once this is over, don't you think?
I would welcome that if that did come about. My experience of 25 years working in the NHS, of 40 years, 45 years of life in this country, makes me sceptical of that, George. We are living in exceptional circumstances. The fact that there's been a massive systemic failure of the economic system, a huge crash in the economy, which was triggered, but I do not think is synonymous with this coronavirus. It's a much bigger and systemic phenomenon. Means that governments are looking for exceptional ways to try and prop up the economy and therefore pump money in various ways into the economy. Now, a huge bailout has happened, overwhelmingly to massive companies. I don't know how much. Richard Branson asked for $7 billion. I very much hope he doesn't get it. The news of whether he's got it or not hasn't come to my knowledge. I know that he's applied for it. He's already the largest GP in the country. He's the manager of GP services for 3 to 4 million people in the southeast of England. He's the largest private hospital owner, managing East Kent hospitals and putting in bids for other services and suing the NHS when he doesn't get them. So this process of privatization is not something which is just conceptual. It's something that's very far advanced. And to reverse that would be a very major undertaking, akin to really the initial founding of the NHS. Now, I very much hope it will happen. It would involve either writing off and saying to the PFI companies, you've made far too much money out of these totally uncompetitive contracts already, and simply wiping off the debt. That's not in the nature of our government to do. They very much value free market, free enterprise, and despite the evidence of systematic failures in the economy, they will do everything they can to prop up that system. So in other words, what they might do is transfer that debt away from the NHS and take it on centrally, which would really amount to us still paying for those contracts. It would mean reversal of marketization of the NHS economy, where currently 20% of the NHS budget is spent on managerial payouts, and a lot of it is around negotiating contracts, because once you buy and sell to yourself, you have to have a process of tendering and overseeing all of the management and legal services that are involved. It would involve reversing the process of putting all the funding, as the NHS Social Care Act 2012 did, of placing all the funding for the NHS in the hands of GPs who are unable actually to plan and manage the service, and currently are merged with KPMG, large accountancy firms, large management consultancy firms who are managing it, and increasingly merging with the health insurance lobby. We've seen only once or twice in this entire episode an appearance from Sir Simon Stevens. Sir Simon Stevens, as I've mentioned to you before, is actually the person who's in charge. He's the chief executive of NHS England, who has day-to-day operational control of the NHS. This person, it's a quango that controls, not Matt Hancock, not Boris Johnson, it's a quango that controls the NHS England. And he has said very, very little to say about the lack of preparedness, the steps that are going to be taken, because his overwhelming strategic objective is to push business in the direction of his old manager. And that manager is United Healthcare. It's one of the biggest, in fact, the biggest health insurance company in the United States. And so all of these opaque details, which are not widely known, despite the fact that this has been going on in a very systematic way for at least 40 years under Labour, Tory, and the condemned government, they're not widely known. And to reverse that, so I'm absolutely sure, as we all feel when we've been treated by the NHS, we feel overcome with emotion and joy. We feel the joy to be alive. We feel the joy that our new babies have been brought into the world, that our cuts have been mended, that our bones have been set, that our operations have been performed. Overwhelmingly successful treatment, and despite how run down it is, the NHS still provides a fantastic service, which is precisely why it's valued by all who use it. But is that enough to contradict the entire ethos of the Conservative outlook, where it's totally not unusual for backbench MPs to denounce the NHS as a Stalinist model of care, which needs to be done away with, to denounce all its inefficiencies, which are induced by the way it's managed, as being due to the fact there's not enough market transparency and market efficiency? Will it undo that entire ethos and push Johnson into being a born-again socialist, at least in the sphere of healthcare?
We'll see.
I hope so, but I'm deeply skeptical.
If I were you, I would cut out and keep every word that he spoke today. And if I were the health service trade unions, we haven't heard very much from trade unions in this crisis, but I'd be cutting out and keeping every word. If I was in the opposition in Parliament, I'd be cutting out every one of those words, and I'd be holding Boris Johnson to them. Do you think there's any chance of any of those things happening?
Very few people seem to be, you pointed out yourself in a video I saw during the week, George, very few people are holding the government to account on their promises. We have so far been promised huge increases in ventilators that haven't been delivered, huge increases in PPE, which are gradually filtering through. We've been promised all the facilities necessary to deal with the pandemic. And whilst drastic measures have been taken, are being taken, the fact that there was a lack of preparedness. If I look back and was writing an article about this very subject today, George, and really we had the full picture and information emerging in February from China. We've had a good 2 months to prepare. All of that time was frittered away. Principally, it was business as usual. And again, if you look at the United States response, where they've got a quarter of cases now, it's business as usual, pursuing the same geopolitical agenda of strategic competitive advantage against their perceived competitors, of pursuing sanctions against Cuba whilst Cuba gives aid to the world, sanctions against China whilst China gives aid to the world, sanctions against Iran while Iran struggles to cope with this problem. So can the leopard change its spots? You know, I have to deeply believe that human beings are capable of change, but I think for us, if we change our government, I do not believe that our current representatives will be the people that we choose to manage those profound changes that are needed in our society.
Lastly, and I'm grateful for your time always, I spoke to a doctor, not you, you're usually the doctor I speak to, but I spoke to a different doctor on Saturday, and she told me that the anger in the profession is palpable, is raging at the very foolish allegation that Hancock made, that somehow you've been wasting PPE, that if there is a shortage, it's because you've been wasting it, misusing it. Are you aware of that feeling of anger?
There's a definite feeling of anger bordering on betrayal, really, of people who are putting their, I mean, there have been several pieces of data that have come out of analysing the patients and the staff, of showing just how far this virus is spreading, that staff are becoming affected. Actually, bus drivers also being affected and disproportionately affected with severe infections, and disproportionately, we've even seen Afro-Caribbean and South Asians disproportionately affected amongst those who are infected and died, precisely because these are frontline workers, people who are living in overcrowded housing, people who have not been taken out of the community for isolation. So all of the very basic, some of the public health models that were put forward by China and so successful haven't been learned, haven't been put into effect. So yes, there is a lot of anger that people are doing their best. They're really risking their own health in order to provide the best possible treatment for their fellow countrymen, for our fellow workers. But we haven't got the levels of support that we need. And promises are made and promises are broken on a daily basis. And that is causing a lot of disillusionment amongst the medical profession and in wider society, George, I think.
Engineer Joe's mum says, Dr. Brar for Prime Minister. There you go. That's one vote you've got for Prime Minister Dr. Ranjeet Brar. That's one vote in the bag. Dr. Ranjeet, thank you very much, as always, for joining us. MOATS medic. I've been surprised at the lack of response to what I had to say earlier about this report. Perhaps it's that most of you have not seen it. And when I looked at my phone in the break, a number of good friends have sent me the entire copy of the report. I know it's tough to read it, but everyone must. I'd go so far as to say this, Joseph. The Labour leadership today is illegitimate. It is an illegitimate regime. It has come to power based on a conspiracy against the previous leadership of the Labour Party, which is a matter for them, but it's a matter for the British people as a whole. The stakes could not have been higher in 2017. Less than 2,500 votes would have kicked the Tories out, put Labour and Corbyn in. So many of the problems, suffering, death that we have since suffered might have been avoided. So every person who is involved in that conspiracy, which is unmasked in this leaked report that Sky News had the only copy of, every person in it is now illegitimized. In my eyes, and I think in the eyes, I hope in the eyes of Labour Party members and Labour Party supporters and believers in democracy everywhere. So I'd go so far as to say that the Labour leader and all those involved in that coup against Corbyn in 2016 and in undermining Corbyn all the way up to the 2017 election are illegitimized. And I, for one, will never forgive them. Mark Burns says, George, what's your take on 5G and its effects on the immune system? Well, I'm not an expert, Mark, but I think it's bollocks. I think the 5G scare runs out of the chemtrails trap. It runs out of all these weird and wonderful conspiracy theories that are multiplying. The radiation from 5G is minimal. People claimed the same about 4G. They claimed it about 3G. They said we shouldn't be forced to wear seatbelts. They said that motorcyclists shouldn't be forced to wear crash helmets. It runs out of that kind of political, philosophical stable, and I consider it to be bollocks. Joshua is in London. Let's hear from him. Joshua, go ahead.
Oh, hi, George.
Hi.
I was just wondering about on the issue of Russia, about how it has. I mean, its infection rate is comparatively lower than ours.
Yeah, although it is picking up in Moscow. Still,
I know, but
still very, very low compared to ours. Yeah.
But I was going to say about the death rate. I mean, do they really have a better healthcare system than us? Because their life expectancy is a bit lower. Not that I'm trying to admonish them, because I have an admiration for them. But why is their death rate so much lower? That's what I was going to focus. That was what I was going to sort of.
I don't know. Is the honest answer? As I said, there are a number of cases is increasing. I spoke to my editor, RT.com, yesterday online, talking about my latest piece, and she said that things were getting a bit more tense in Moscow because most of the cases in Russia, which is, as you know, a gigantic country with 7 time zones, but most of the cases were in Moscow. And I see some pictures in the paper today of lines of ambulances waiting to get into Moscow hospitals. So I don't know if they will escape in the way that it looked a week ago that they would escape with very low numbers. And I don't know if they've got a better health system than us. I think a lot of countries have now got a better health system than us. But whether Russia is one of them, I don't know. The truth is that the life expectancy in Russia is partly to do with the extremely rugged living conditions in many, many parts of the vast country. Until recently, high level of smoking, and until recently, very high levels of drinking alcohol. I would guess that they are 3 reasons why Russia has a lower life expectancy than us. But although I'm a Russian asset, I'm not actually a Russian expert. Over to you, Joshua. One last point.
Well, I would say it's partly a result of lower population density, but I think also because, and this is when I'm going to praise Putin for his, assertive measures. I do honestly think that his rules, as authoritarian as they may be, are actually having an effect. I mean, they must be. And I do not buy it that in a country of nearly 150 million people, considering that your TV show is, aligned with RT, as we can see on the screen. I do not believe it that the Russian media, for all their efforts, could cover up a mass mortality of Russians. No. That's impossible. Any more than the Chinese could.
As a matter of fact, media, hostile, anti-Putin, anti-government media proliferates in Russia, and Western journalists are everywhere in Russia. And, of course, the secret state of all countries never sleeps. Joshua, thanks very much for that. Let me go to Scott in Glasgow. Go ahead, Scott.
Yes, hello, George. And I realise every second on your show is premium. But can I briefly repeat the words of the brilliant Dr. Ranjeet Brar? The reversing of the NHS privatisation will be akin to the foundation of the NHS. Those words are chilling. And that guy is absolutely brilliant.
He is.
But I'll briefly go...
Wouldn't it be wonderful if he was the Minister of Health?
Oh, God. I mean, we haven't got a Minister of Health. We've got a Minister of Privatisation. it would be amazing if we had actually had a Minister of Health. If it was Dr. Ranjeet Brar, my God. Anyway, the point, as I say, every second is a premium on your show, and I very much appreciate it being on. So, I mean, George, Boris Johnson repeatedly asserted the NHS is not up for sale or privatisation, while all the time selling and privatising the NHS. My point is that it's a crime that's been committed here. It's not that he didn't make a mistake or any of the other stuff I see online. It was no mistake there. He has facilitated the movement from the bottom to the top of money. That's his job, and that's what he's done.
Well, let's be fair, Scott, he's only been the Prime Minister for a few months.
Yes, but he has not been...
This started with Margaret Thatcher, was continued by Major, and by Blair, and by Brown, and by Cameron, and by May.
Indeed. Obviously, we knew Thatcher. She started the privatisation with the cleaning services. It went on from there, and the rest.
And the dinners, yeah.
Yes, but my point being, George, that if Tony Blair suddenly had a epiphany moment and said, "I'm sorry about the deaths in Iraq, and I'm sorry about all that happened there. Can we start again?" What would you say?
I'd say, what are you going to do? And that's the same thing I'm saying to Boris Johnson. Indeed, I said so in my monologue. If you're going to now pay the NHS workers fairly, fund their service adequately, bring them wholly back into the public sector, cancel their student debts, if you're going to do all these things, I'll believe your words. If you don't do them, then I'll regard them only as words.
Okay, George.
All right.
Come back to you there.
Many thanks, Scott. A very succinct and good call. Now, there really isn't enough hanging space in the wall, in the Hall of Fame this week for all the people we want to honour, because there's more than 1.5 million of them across the UK. 1.5 million people who care for us, who put their lives on the line for us every day, especially now. Some of them, at least, some of them least financially rewarded, and in the midst of this pandemic are now the most appreciated, and rightly so. The vast majority of us always knew our National Health Service was the best thing in our lives. Those of us lucky enough to live in Britain, and even those who wanted to privatise it, suck its lifeblood, who wanted insurance companies to take it over, who've already let in people like Richard Branson to feed on it, have now been forced to praise it through clenched teeth and perhaps a face mask or a respirator. People like Boris Johnson, who, with all but one of his parliamentary Tory colleagues, voted down a pay rise for nurses in 2017 after 7 years of real cuts to their wages. Boris Johnson, who campaigned to leave the European Union from a bus which, splashed along its sides, promised a further £350 million a week for the NHS. And when this is all over, Boris, we're going to hold you to that. Boris Johnson, whose life last week was saved, as he himself has now said, by the NHS. Health Secretary Matt Hancock, I thought it was Tony, who also caught the coronavirus. He tried to blame frontline staff for the shortage of life-saving personal protective equipment by accusing them of overusing it, changing it too much, as if this was some hospital dressing-up game. It was the same Hancock who, when asked during the week how many NHS staff had died protecting us from the virus, immediately shuffled the question to the chief nursing officer, who refused to give a figure, citing confidentiality. 2 days later, Hancock was forced to give the figure. He said it was 19 dead, although 2 mortalities have been added to it since then, and actually the figure, according to some, is 32. And more, of course, will follow through the ineptitude of the handling of this pandemic to date. The NHS began, of course, after the Second World War, with the election of a Labour government led by Clement Attlee. The minister in charge of it was one of the great Labour figures, Aneurin Bevan. At its launch by Bevan in 1948, he said it had at heart 3 core principles: that it meets the needs of everyone, that it be free at the point of delivery, and that it be based on clinical need, not ability to pay. And so it remains largely until now. But if we don't go on to the offensive now and demand that all the ways in which the NHS has been cheapened, has been privatized, has been under-resourced, has been distorted from its original principles, then we will have missed an enormous opportunity. It's one of the reasons why I hate these flat earth deniers so much. Instead of rising to this set of circumstances which now face us, in which we can make demands which would have seemed utopian and hopeless even a few months ago, we are now in a position to say to the Conservative Prime Minister of Britain, we're going to hold you to every single word you just said about the NHS. And I've given earlier the ways in which I think Boris Johnson can put into deeds the noble and beautiful words that he used in his broadcast earlier. Who would you least like to be isolated with? Donald Trump, 28%. Boris Johnson, 16%. Katie Hopkins, 56%. You can still vote on my Twitter feed. Now, let's leave the rest of the time to calls while I'm waiting for the next one to come up. George, my wife Julie had cancer 3 times over 9 years. I lost her almost 5 years ago. At a number of times in her treatment, particularly during chemotherapy, we were aware that any infection could be lethal. I'm sure coronavirus would have killed her, but it would have been the coup de grace. I understand your road traffic accident analogy. I have to say, though, it would lead to a strange hiatus where terminal illness disappeared. We need more subtlety at this time. And Mushabar says, I've been a fan of yours for many years, love your passion for speaking the truth. I enjoy the show, I tune in every week. My question is, why does the government get away with continuing to undercut and neglect the National Health Service? They have known that the NHS has been ill-equipped and vulnerable to such an outbreak for years. John Pilger did a great job of covering this in his recent documentary. Indeed so, John Pilger does a great job of everything. And Paul says, some hospitals are half empty because all non-emergency procedures have been cancelled and the resources are focused on COVID-19. Let's take one of our veteran callers, always worth hearing. It's Guy in Stoke-on-Trent. Guy, welcome.
Yeah, happy Easter, George.
Happy Easter.
Yeah, George, about my local hospital here, it's just up the road, a couple of miles away. The A&E now is shut at this hospital. There's a big A&E department. The A&E has been moved to another hospital in the city. Our local hospital now has had 3 temporary refrigerated morgues added to the on-site morgue. If there is any diminishing of patients entering that hospital, it's because the resources, the nurses, the doctors, are being used to deal with COVID patients. And finally, I should say that at that hospital, they've now created or built a ward purely to deal with COVID patients.
Yeah, I've seen the testimony of nurses and doctors who have a ward of 25 COVID patients, and the expected mortality rate of them there is about half. I've seen the nurse. Now, I don't believe these nurses are actors or that they're lying, but it's an amazing number of people seem to think they are, Guy.
Well, they're absolutely not lying. What I'm trying to say is that if there are less people entering that hospital, it's because the hospital is focusing its resources. Maybe they've got no other resources. That's what Ranjeet said, to deal with every other patient,
That's
unfortunately.
right.
But can I just say something about Boris Johnson and the intensive care?
Yeah.
Yeah. If Boris Johnson was on a ventilator, he would
No,
be...
he wasn't. He wasn't on a ventilator.
No,
he was
no.
on an oxygen tube.
Yeah. If he needed ventilation, he'd have been on ICU. He may have been on ICU.
He was.
But he certainly never got ventilated.
No, he never got ventilated. It's never been claimed that he got ventilated.
Oxygen could have been administered via nasal clips or even a normal mask.
Yeah.
But he would probably been put there, so as if it was necessary, the facility was there.
Yeah. Well, he named them. He named all these wonderful doctors and nurses in his broadcast today, and I thought it was quite moving. Actually, I'm not ashamed to say that. I'd be ashamed if I didn't call him out if he refused to follow up with action, because words are cheap. When somebody's just saved your life, it's good that you should thank them so fulsomely. But if you then walk by on the other side of the road, ignoring what they need from you, then you're a grade A, aren't you?
Can I suggest that Keir Starmer's medal is presented to Boris, and the NHS staff get funded, get PPE, get ventilators, get a pay rise, and get accredited?
Excellent. Good policy. Thanks, Guy. Let's go to Hamid in London. Hamid?
Yeah, hi. Just talking about the NHS. I wanted to refer to this is basically the Milton Friedman economics, which came in the 70s from the Chicago School of Economics.
Yeah.
They experimented with it in Chile, as you know, with the coup against the socialist government, and then Mrs. Thatcher brought it in with Keith Joseph in Britain in the 80s, as you know, privatization.
Unfortunately, I lived through it all, Hamid. Yes, go on.
Yeah, so I remember I was at university, people were buying shares and queuing up to buy shares in BT with 50p and selling them on for £1.50. The same with the water companies, and then the trains later, which then came back, they sold all the assets off, and then they came back for subsidies, like Mr. Branson, he was getting subsidies on Virgin trains for years and years and years after.
Oh yeah, they get 3 times the public money subsidising them than British Rail received when the railways were publicly owned.
Yes, that's why I was a little bit upset when you said you would support Tony Blair if he came back and he said X and Y. Because he was fundamentally wrong, and he was in the pocket of these people.
I really didn't.
So how could you even forgive him?
I really didn't say that. I said that I'd say to him, well, what are you going to do about the sins that you have committed? What are you going to do about them? God doesn't forgive.
Bring back the dead people in
that's
Iraq,
right.
Can he?
That's right. Exactly.
And the other point I had, I'm sorry to say, you know, your Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I disagree with Bernie Sanders being put in there. Because Bernie Sanders, although I think what he does, he takes away the energy which would go into a third party or protest, and he kills it off by these presidential campaigns.
Well, that's a good point. I need to press on because of the hour, but it's a very good...
He said, I support Joe Biden. He said, I would support him.
Yeah.
He's a friend of mine.
I'll tell you what, Hamid, we will give consideration to removing Bernie Sanders from the Hall of Fame. There you go. I'll let you know next week the result of that consideration. Let's go to Tess in London. Go ahead, Tess.
Hi, George. It's Tess, Wales, not London.
It says London here. I beg your pardon. Go ahead, Tess.
God bless him. Anyway, you've had some fraggles calling in tonight. You know, your conspiracy chums.
Yes.
And I've got a couple of them in real life, and I've sort of fallen out with them. And sometimes they can be quite fun in a way, but at the moment, they're really starting
I'm not
to
finding it funny at all, no.
No, I know. And I think what's happening with these people, a lot of them are quite clever people in real life. And I think their energy is really misguided here. And I think it's all to do with trust. You know, nobody trusts their government anymore.
Right. And
imagine in wartime,
you're exactly right. Nobody trusts their government because the government has lied to them over and over and over again. And so the credibility of the state, its agencies, its governments is an all-time low. So people don't believe things even when they're true.
No, exactly. But they need to move that energy along and use it to do good stuff for the NHS, like we've been talking about tonight. And they need to listen to Ranjeet. And it's absurd. They won't listen to Ranjeet, right? I keep trying to get them to watch his stuff. And they say, no, because he's part of the narrative.
Yeah, we're all gatekeepers, even Dr. Ranjeet Brar, imagine.
You're the worst out of all of them, mate.
Yeah, I'm the gatekeeper. I'm actually secretly working for capitalism, for imperialism, all this time.
Yeah.
And it's been such an ill-rewarded quest, I must say. Tess, thank you very much indeed. Chris is in Colchester on Bernie Sanders. Let's hear from him. Chris.
Hi, George, all right?
Yeah, good, thank you.
I did tell you so about Sanders. I mean, I always said he was a fraud.
You turned out to be right and I turned out to be wrong. My apologies.
Well, no, it's fine. I mean, there's enough misery at the moment, so I'm not, I just think we've just got to pay attention to what a politician does and not what he says. I think he's less integrity than Corbyn, and people like him and AOC, they're all theatre. They've got the talk, but they don't walk the walk, I'm afraid. And I just can't believe that Donald Trump is around sort of even money to win the presidency still. So,
it's amazing, isn't it? It's absolutely amazing.
I had this hunch that Michelle Obama would be the VC, the vice president nomination from Biden, but it doesn't seem to be going. So I think it could be Hillary Clinton. And would it surprise you if they just said, look, Biden's not competent, and at the last minute they just put someone like Clinton in?
It wouldn't surprise me, no. I think that would be the most risky thing for them to do. But it's not impossible. They could put Cuomo as the VP and then do that, or Michelle Obama.
I think it'll be a woman.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a woman, and then that's Hillary's perfect chance. She's got a corpse. Is the only thing to stop her from becoming president. I mean,
she'd soon be rid of him. I'll tell you that, Chris.
I know.
she'd push him off a bridge before you could say Jack Robinson. Thanks a lot, Chris, for that call. I need to go to Gibraltar, where Al is on the line. Go ahead, Al.
Yes, I'm very good, George. Yes, are you okay yourself?
Yes, I'm great. Good to hear from you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just a very quick point that I firmly believe this whole thing it's part of a major economic war between the Chinese, the US, and the Western world, and that the Chinese government, what they've basically just done by allowing this pathogen, if you like, to spread globally, is they've created a massive crime against humanity worldwide, and they should be called to account. But we're in an economic war.
How do you stop a virus spreading, Al?
I beg your pardon?
How do you stop a virus spreading?
We don't know, do we? We don't know.
No, but you've just blamed China for spreading it across the world.
Well, they allowed when they closed Wuhan.
But you're using the word allowed. I'm saying to you, how would you not allow a pathogen, a deadly virus? How would you stop it?
I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a specialist in that area. Perhaps I used the wrong word. But what we did do, which was wrong, when they closed Wuhan down, they allowed international flights to leave Wuhan, and thus the spread took place.
Well, it was up to the people to whom these aeroplanes flew to say they wouldn't take any calls, any flights from Wuhan, surely.
Yeah, but the Chinese knowing the gravity of the situation...
Well, they didn't just they know, they told you. They told everybody. At the end of December, they reported it. Then they mapped the genome and gave it to everybody free.
George, they told everybody at the end of December. When were the first cases? When did they first come to light? The end of November.
I don't know. That's actually a moot point. And it's now becoming a subject of great academic and investigative interest about where exactly and when exactly these first cases emerged. I think you might find that your ire for China is misplaced, Al, but thanks for the call. Frank is in Dumbarton, from one rock to another rock. Dumbarton Rock. Go ahead, Frank.
Hi, George.
Hi.
Hail, hail. How are you doing, mate?
Good, nice to hear from you.
I've not spoken to you since you used to work at that parochial station.
Yeah, the local, when I was on local radio, yeah.
Yeah. I used to pick you up on AM or something like that. But anyway, I'm not going to waste your time, right? What I was wanting to say was, like, I'm going to have a miffed with this carry on with the media. I think they're all this kumbaya and clapping out windows and gym sessions and houses and all that. It's just to take my minds off of what's really going on. And it really annoys me, the media. They want us all clapping for the NHS, right? And then for the ground with a begging bowl, they're shutting their doors and their windows, you know what I'm talking about? So they want me.
I'm clapping. I'm clapping, Frank, out my window, and so is every person on my street.
They're getting it wrong. So, George, the NHS are brilliant, right? They looked after my mum and dad, God rest them. They couldn't be better, right? I love them so much. But what they're actually asking today, the media is applauding for the government.
Oh, no. That would be a big ask, especially in Dumbarton. Nobody's going to applaud the government. That much I'm absolutely sure of. Frank, you need to get off the line because there's a legend. Just appeared. It's Norma in Bristol. And she wants more time tonight. So what she wants, she gets. Go ahead, Norma.
I don't know, George. No, it's just 2 points, really. And it's not moaning tonight. It's about ventilators. Now, I hope this is true, but CND and General Electric workers. Now, General Electric workers, I've got this quoting off Twitter, which isn't always true, but I hope it is. They normally make jet engines, and they say that their facilities are lying idle at the moment. And, well, the country faces a dire shortage of ventilators. And the workers have launched a protest for them to make ventilators. And the second point on ventilators is CND. Excuse me, I got a cough. And they said that it was on April the 9th that nuclear weapons contractor is destined to make 10,000 ventilators. Now, I don't know whether I really believe it, but it does prove that maybe with Trident, money can be diversified a little bit, and General Electric workers, they want to use their skills. I hope they're able to do it. Have you heard anything about this?
Well, I have been proselytizing this point all of my life. The number of jobs that you would generate by diversifying defense industry workers and capital is multiple, 10 times more. You'd get 10 times more jobs if you use these men, women, and equipment to do better and more necessary things. So for those who say, well, we have to be an arms dealer to the world because look at who'd be unemployed, the number that would be unemployed if we stopped being it. But of course, the multiplier of alternative employment is considerable indeed. But on the question, Norma, of ventilators, Britain received this week donations of 300 ventilators from Turkey. Okay. Now, I don't know about you, and I mean no disrespect to Turkish people at all, but when did we become in such a parlous place that we needed donations of medical equipment from Turkey? Do you see my point?
I do. But I mean, do you see the point I'm trying to make is that General Electric workers, they really have made a protest. They've launched this one to make more.
Good.
And the other thing is the CND, apparently they want to do it, diversify into it. I just hope they do, because this is going to last a long time, isn't it?
Alas, alas. Now, you lay off the cigarettes, won't you? I don't want you coughing your way through these interviews.
No.
Thank you. Norma the legend, thanks very much. Who would you least like to be isolated with? Donald Trump, 28%. Boris Johnson, 16%. Katie Hopkins wins it out the park. 1,208 of you voted. 56% of you had the good taste to less like to be isolated with Katie Hopkins than either of the others. Jane A. Says that she'd least like to be isolated with Keith Starmer. Steve says Diana Abacus. Who's Diana Abacus? It's Diane Abbott. Tom G says Putin. Stuart H says Owen Jones, but that would not be a nightmare. Very, very funny indeed. Let me try and get in some last-minute messages. Craig says, what are your thoughts on the increase in employers advertising for zero-hour contract essential workers at these times? I believe that zero-hour contract working should be illegal. Chakita says, Boris is a boring clown. Katie and myself would agree on a lot. We would just disagree on who is to blame. And I'm sure Trump would have a lot of interesting stories too. I think Trump would like to get you into isolation, Chakita. Danny says, I think Boris Johnson would be the most tolerable. Katie Hopkins come last. I find her vile. Donald will probably be entertaining for the first 5 minutes, then get extremely annoying. But at least you'd get to the bottom of the secret of his tan and his hairdo. Is that hair real? Is he really that tanned? How long does he spend oranging himself up and fitting his rug every morning? I don't know. I'm only saying. Paul says, the poll is unfair. Can we have an all three option? And Jim says, surely if this virus has done one thing, it has established that the NHS is irreplaceable. Boris Johnson himself has endorsed the brilliance and excellence of our healthcare system. The private sector does not belong anywhere near our jewel in the crown. I tend to agree with you on that, Jim. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. But the devil is, of course, in the detail, and we have to make sure that that detail is A, widely known, and if known, supported, and that we somehow generate the political opposition necessary to force the Prime Minister to implement it. Broken76 says, uninformed George about the coronavirus. And Brian H., I used to think George was unbiased. Now I know he's not. I'm gutted. I'm totally biased, Brian. I always have been totally biased. L.A. Taylor says, Bill Gates is in cahoots with Mark Zuckerberg. What's that meant to mean? Stevie G. Wiz says, Gigi is scared of Ofcom. Stevie G. Wiz Ofcom has no power over this broadcast. You see, when you're into the world, the tangled world of conspiracy theories, you're left thinking, why is George Galloway disagreeing with me? It cannot be because he disagrees with me. It must be because he's afraid of Ofcom. Except Ofcom don't regulate internet broadcasting. Stevie, gee whiz. It's been marvellous for me. Hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next week at the same time, same place. Good night.